Sorry, hi, good afternoon. As we are settling in, just want to explain very briefly. So part of today's presentation will include clickers, student participation with clickers which are being distributed. We don't have enough clickers for every single student. Actually, I'm looking at, we may. I didn't realize we won't have every single student here. But generally, the idea is, we probably have enough to share between students, okay? Please, this is a central note. Make sure you return the clicker at the end of the session before you leave, okay? We've suffered losses in our clickers, and this is why we do not have enough for every single student. So please, if you're opting to take a clicker, I think you will need to give in your, Darren, is that right? They give in their ID, okay? Take the clicker, it's fun, interactive. Make sure at the end of the session, you give back the clicker and you take your student ID. That was a public, what is it, public service announcement or something like that? That's what they call it. It's a public service announcement. Thank you. Okay, if you could settle in, please, so we can get started. As soon as I figure out how this mic comes alive. How does this mic come alive? Okay. So, good afternoon. Is this too loud? Bit loud. So just a quick reminder of what I was just saying earlier. So part of today's presentation will include student interaction with clickers, which are being distributed by the graduate assistant. So if you would like to participate, please pick up a clicker. Make sure you return it at the end of today's session. Right? That's how you get your ID back, I think. All right, so in order to get started and hopefully finish well within the time frame for today's session, so today's presentation is a kind of a build-up on our presentation last time, which again, I'm sorry you're seeing me for the second lecture in a row, and I apologize. So today we'll be moving slightly forward in time with St. Thomas Aquinas, and our focus today on what we may refer to as the medieval synthesis, or perhaps more properly speaking, as scholasticism. And as a matter of setting up today's presentation, I want to make reference to this painting up here, which is certainly not from the Scholastic era, and certainly not from the classical era. This is actually a 19th century painting by Ludwig Seitz, but I like to use it as a backdrop for today's presentation because I think it does a very good job of capturing at least the ethos, the spirit of what we will be discussing in our presentation today. And what you have here, first and foremost, is the very title speaks clearly for itself. Seitz entitled this painting from the 19th century, Faith and Reason United. Right? And when we speak about scholasticism or the medieval synthesis, particularly here, we're going to be illustrating it with Thomas Aquinas. This is one of the basic premises, the union of faith and reason. And in the actual painting itself, what you have, sitting from your side, on the left hand, you have faith represented, and on the right hand, you have reason represented. And clearly, they're having a very cordial discussion. They were, very nice get-together. More interestingly, perhaps, for the purposes of today's lecture, is the grayscale in the backdrop, where on both the right-hand side and the left-hand side, you'll see a figure, an adult figure with younger figures around him. And that is actually Thomas Aquinas, represented in that painting. And the idea is, on both sides of the painting, both behind reason and behind faith, you see the doctor, you see Aquinas teaching and sharing his knowledge. And that's why we want to, launch here with this notion that in a manner of speaking, Thomas Aquinas can be seen as a great exemplar, a great illustration of this notion of faith and reason united, right? Last point about the painting also is interesting, the inscription above, which is taken, from a proclamation by Pope Leo XIII, and the inscription reads in English, I'm not going to read it in Latin, obviously, the splendor of the divine truths received into the mind helps the understanding, right? And this is one of the basic premises of what later we reference as Thomism, right? Thomism in reference, of course, to Thomas Aquinas. So this is what we'll be focused on today. As you can see on the fly sheet, the aims of the lecture and the process. I'll make reference to the fly sheet once in a while, though most of our work will be up here on the screen. As a quick background, just a bit on the terminology and the evaluation, if you wish, the historical evaluation. So the term itself comes from scholastic or scholasticos, right? Which literally is a person who is learned, a person, studious, if you wish. That's the etymology of the term. And it begins to be used later on to refer to the teachers and the church men, the people of the habit, so to speak, who were essentially the teachers in the universities, in the schools, right? Keeping in mind that the universities were, of course, themselves established by the Church Institute. So it becomes to be a general reference to teachers and figures in the tradition who begin to base their work both on the church fathers, the people like Augustine and others, but also bringing in Aristotelian corpus, the Aristotelian philosophy. And this is the term synthesis here that we're going to be talking about, right? The medieval synthesis essentially between faith and reason, between references in religious tradition, and religious narrative, right, the church fathers, but also references in the philosophic tradition, namely Aristotle. Right? Still trying to figure out how this works. There we go. No, that's back, right? Here we go. Now, it has to be said that scholasticism as a tradition is not exactly usually coupled with a favorable evaluation, right? And I'll give you just two illustrations, one from the 15th century and the second from the 19th century, how it was generally viewed. So this is barely a century or so after what you might call the decline of the scholastic tradition, where you have Laurentius Valla say that the superstitious and senseless race of professors who make their pupils swear never to contradict Aristotle, right? That's his reference to the scholastics. They are a race of senseless professors, right, who make you swear never to contradict Aristotle. 4 centuries after Valhalla, the French, Valla, not Valhalla, Valhalla is a different place. The 19th century French critic Hippolyte Taine writes 3 centuries, so he's referring to the scholastic age. He says 3 centuries at the bottom of that gloomy abyss did not add a single idea to man's intellectual
But I hope through today's lecture to move with you together towards kinder words on understanding and evaluating the scholastic tradition. Okay? I don't think it's a surprise that subsequent ages are very critical of their predecessors, particularly in the age of the Renaissance, you know, when you speak about Valla or the 19th century. But I think there's a lot more to say about the scholastic age and the medieval synthesis, or at least the exercise at medieval synthesis, than captured in these two evaluations. Hopefully, at least that's what we'll get a sense of here today. Before we do that, before we launch into our discussion on scholasticism and medieval synthesis, however, I invite you to join me in a thought exercise, if you will. Right? A thought exercise. And the thought exercise begins like this. Right? And this is where your clickers come in. So imagine, if you will, imagine that you were a person of monotheistic faith, right? Very much engrossed in the monotheistic narrative. And you are also a man or woman of certain authority, and one with broad scholarly interests. And imagine that you were informed of the recent discovery of a corpus, a large body of works, written in a language of times past, in an ancient language, ancient texts, essentially. And there is a general suspicion that this amount of works discovered may contain much of the wisdom of the past, right? So there's this suspicion that this body of works that's been discovered contains a large part of the ancient wisdom. So the question to you is, what would you do in that case? Would you procure the corpus and make sure that no word of such discovery gets out until you can figure out what to do with it? Do you make sure that no word of such a discovery ever gets out and destroy the corpus, burn it perhaps? Do you bring together a group of scholars to study and translate the corpus, or do you procure the corpus and sell it to the highest bidder? What would you do? I can't see the responses. Let's try to bring it in a bit. Right, I'll give it just a few. Darren, do we have an estimate? How many clickers out there? About 30? About 30? Okay, good. Thank you. All right. Okay, so there we go. We have 30-something. So let's see how we voted here today. Ooh, lovely. 0% would sit on this discovery. That's fantastic. 3% would destroy it. That's fantastic, I guess. 90% will bring together a group of scholars to study and translate the corpus. I salute you. Very, very Ayubite of you. And 7% entrepreneurs in the room who would procure the corpus and sell it to the highest bidder. And why not, right? Okay. So let's play along, shall we? And let's say the 90%, you know, majority wins the day, and we'll say, all right, so let's do that. Let's get a group of scholars and let's start translating. But here's what begins to surface. The more you translate, or the more these scholars translate, the more it becomes kind of, I don't want to say apparent, but the suspicion grows that the content of the works being translated may actually pose quite a challenge to the accepted worldview, quite a challenge to the accepted beliefs and traditions. The more that's translated, the more content that comes out that may, and I insist, may be seen as challenging the accepted worldview. Now, what would you do? Would you make a public announcement of the discovery and its contents, urging all people to re-examine their accepted worldview? Would you burn all the manuscripts, brand anyone who would mention them and their contents as criminal or heretic, or, you know, I don't know what your favorite label is? Do you continue studying further and seek out from them what may indeed be of much use to us? Or do you cover up the fact that they were being translated, pretend they just got discovered, and sell to the highest bidder? So I'll await your responses on this. Tough decisions. Do you continue studying? Make a public announcement urging people to re-examine their world system? Do you burn? Do you sell? 30-something again, yeah? All right, so we'll just go. Sorry, I can't see the exact number of, I see 30-something responses. All right, let's see where we're at now. Okay, good. You might notice a slight difference in the numbers, but actually if you put together A and C, we're still around the 90%, right? Still around, well, 85, so we've lost 5% of the students. So 11% would say make a public announcement urging people to re-examine their beliefs. Quite courageous, right? 6% burn. That's gone up, right? Wasn't it 3%, I think? The sellers also has gone up slightly. We have 9% who would now sell it. Let somebody else deal with this problem, right? And 74% would continue studying further, right? But I think overall we're still more or less around the same. And this is very telling, by the way. And remember, this is 2017. But this was actually similar, very similar to the situation about 800-something, 900-something years ago, all right? This takes us now to Toledo, because a very similar situation actually happened, as I said, about 900 years ago, around the 1080s, when the reconquests of the Andalus and Spain began. One of the discoveries when they reconquered Toledo, is in the Library of Toledo, was this phenomenal corpus of works that they had thought were lost, particularly Aristotle's works. Not only were they rediscovered, but what was also discovered along with them is an immense output of commentaries, translations. If you remember our friend Ibn Rushd, he did quite a bit of commentaries. Maimonides, certainly, many others. So not only was there a rediscovery of this corpus in Toledo, but there was actually a rediscovery of Aristotle along with commentators, sharh, kind of people who were interpreting Aristotle, building on Aristotle. So an immense discovery. And in fact, the decision was taken at the time to translate, to study these works. I have to say, of course, there was not, when you say public and make this public, at the time you can't really speak about making things public in the sense we understand, so that would be a bit anachronistic. But there was certainly an embrace, they embraced this discovery, put together a group of scholars, and started to translate these works with full support, if you wish, from the universities, the scholars and whatnot. And this picked up. This is what we call the Toledo event, if you wish. Didn't just remain in Toledo, in Spain. It picked up and it traveled, and Google Maps wasn't there at the time, but it gives us an idea of how it traveled. Because the interest also was not only in Spain. These works were then studied and studied further in southern France, and all the way down to Palermo in Sicily, where quite a bit of work happened there, because there was a ruling king who was very much in favor of these studies. A very marginal note, if I may, a note of interest perhaps. The centers of study were actually, a lot of the times, they coincided with centers where the monotheistic traditions, the three monotheistic traditions coexisted comfortably, right? Starting from Toledo to Marseille to Palermo in Sicily. So there's this general kind of common interest within the monotheistic tradition, which was, of course, encouraged also by the coexistence, if you wish, of these various monotheistic traditions. And it was in Palermo, perhaps, that one of the greatest kind of achievements of this movement, of this translation and study movement, at the hands of William Moerbeke, who is, as far as we know, some evidence would suggest, was very familiar with our author of today, with Thomas Aquinas, and they may have actually communicated quite a bit. Because at his hands you have finally the complete translation of Aristotle's metaphysics and physics and other works, but mostly, the kind of the collection of the complete works, okay? So this moves all the way from Toledo and kind of has a ripple effect and a snowball effect, if you wish, and because, as I said, they had thought these works to have been lost, and this rediscovery triggered an immense amount of study, very much like what you today, in 2017, voted we should do. Though some of you voted we should burn them. And of course, at the times, I would imagine some also would have suggested burning them. On that note, just again, a quick question to you, just thought exercise. So who do you think really was the main push, the main kind of impetus behind bringing together these scholars in Toledo and starting off this immense kind of ripple effect? Who was the main supporter of this movement? Do you think it was the common people of Toledo, the political powers, the Archbishop of Toledo, or the scholars and schoolmen of Toledo? Who do you think would have been the greatest champion for this cause? The common people, the political powers, the archbishop, or the scholars and schoolmen? Thought exercise. We're at the 30-something mark. All right, let's see how you voted. Okay, so 0% have faith in the common people of the time. I think, fine, okay. 20% suggest it might have been the political powers. 17%, interesting, suggest it's the Archbishop of Toledo. And of course, D is wrong, scholars and schoolmen of Toledo. But, I mean, I'm sorry, that was a little trap. We've been speaking about scholasticism and schoolmen, and so you'd imagine it's the school men and the scholars. But it was actually the Archbishop of Toledo. Right? And I want to make this point clear, not only to make those who voted 17% happy, but also to make it very clear, because even nowadays we have this kind of what I think can be called a misconception of the natural, some would even say, or kind of historical conflict between the religious institute and philosophy and the study of philosophy and interest in these. That's actually not accurate. Right? Yes, sure, you can find it once in a while. Right? The conflict is there. We sensed a bit of it with maybe Ibn Rushd at some point, and Maimonides when he packed up his stuff and left Andalus. But it was not as clear-cut as that. And here's a perfect example where it was actually the Archbishop of Toledo who fully championed this, fully supported this. And I kind of tried to give you a hint earlier on, which some of you may have picked up on, because the translators were actually housed in the cathedral in Toledo. That's where most of the early work took place, right, in the 12th century. So what I want to put across here, as before we move and obviously see a lot more of that with Aquinas, is not to think in terms of these preconceived lines of conflict between religious worldview and philosophical worldview, right? The project of the medieval synthesis that you will see in Thomas Aquinas, and the project of it also sensed perhaps with Ibn Rushd in terms of determining the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion, right, is precisely this notion of that there is a role. What is the role is the discussion. What role is there for philosophical reasoning? And I need to be always very clear when I say philosophy here, we mean, the Greek understanding, felsefa, philosophia, right? Not just, rational thought. Good? So keep that in mind as we move forward. And before we move forward, just a final quick background digression, if you wish, because I want to make sure we're clear that, yes, the Toledo event was a huge event, definitely. But it would be somewhat amiss to suggest it all started there, right? There was obviously already interest. The Toledo event was just simply a great discovery that fueled the interest. But you can go back much further than the Toledo event and Archbishop Raymond and other key players on the scene. You can go back as far actually as Boethius in the 6th century. Not that we want necessarily to speak about scholasticism as such, but this idea of what Ludwig Seitz called the faith and reason united, or the conversation or the dialogue between the two. That's already there. Boethius had very much addressed it, and he was actually writing at a time where he was sensing that there was more and more move towards the Latin as more of a standard language, and he was worried about the Greek being lost and the works of the Greeks. So, for instance, he set himself down to translating Plato from the Greek to the Latin, just to make sure we don't lose that. Moving forward, of course, you have John Scotus Erigena, very central figure up in Ireland. Scotus here doesn't mean Scotland, by the way. It means Ireland. And Erigena also means Irish-born. And Ireland was an interesting case, if you wish, because they were still using Greek as the language of education, right? And so they still had, if you wish, access to the Greek texts. And John Scotus was very much a figure who was interested in studying and translating the Greek authors, the Greek philosophical works. And this is a quote from one of his works, for instance, where it's very clear that he's already thinking along the lines of what we're calling here the synthesis, where he says, Christ wears two shoes in the world, scripture and nature, right? Natural philosophy. Both are necessary to understand the Lord, and at no stage can creation be seen as a separation of things from God. If you roll back to Ibn Rushd, who said somewhat along similar lines, as the further we study the art and we understand the art, the more we understand the artisan. Right? There's no real separation. It's very difficult to distance creation from the creator. Right? And that's, again, one of the key issues in this attempt at medieval synthesis. St. Anselm is perhaps taken by many to be the first clearest expression of scholasticism. He's very much known for instance, his ontological argument for proofs of God's existence and other works. All I'm trying to say, I won't go into the details. There's also Abelard, who's a very, very famous figure in this tradition. Just a quick, interesting anecdote. When he had a son, he didn't name him after any of the saints. He didn't name him after any of the great figures. He named him Astrolabe. Do you know what an astrolabe is? It's an instrument that you look at the stars to navigate. And Haram, his son, he was called an astrolabe. But just to give you an idea of this, the importance of science, the natural world, very important figure, Abelard. Obviously, many, many more we could mention, right? Many, many more. I'm just bringing this up to say, of course, nothing comes out of a vacuum, right? Neither does Socrates come out of a vacuum, nor does Aquinas come out of a vacuum, nor Ibn Rushd. There's a tradition that's been working. There's ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's more explicit than other times. But certainly the Toledo event was a big movement, most definitely. Good? And with that, I just want to try to see how many of you were paying attention right from the beginning. So I want to go back very briefly as a quick question, drop quiz, on the painting we started off with by Ludwig Seitz. And I just want to ask you, who was featured on both sides in the background of the painting by Ludwig Seitz that we made reference to at the beginning of today's presentation? Right? Was it Pope Leo XIII, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine of Hippo, or Averroes, Ibn Rushd? Remember the painting we started with? Who was featured on both sides, the right side and the left side in the background? Was it Pope Leo XIII, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine of Hippo, or Averroes? Ibn Rushd. 30-something answers. Goody. 70%. That's not bad. That's not bad. No, sorry. Pope Leo was the author of the inscription, but definitely it wasn't Augustine. It was indeed Thomas Aquinas. And on that note, let's move to say something about our author for today. So, what I've been trying to lead up to, of course, I think it's become very clear now that what we're looking at here, Thomas Aquinas, is as an illustration of this medieval synthesis which we've preluded, this notion of bringing together the Aristotelian corpus, or at least some aspects of it, or at least answering the question, is there something I can bring from that corpus, into a discussion on monotheistic faith, right? Something along the lines that perhaps you saw in Ibn Rushd, of course, right? The question of the role of place of philosophy in a monotheistic context. The difference is what you read from Ibn Rushd, as we said, was not one of his philosophical works. It was one of his works about the role and place of philosophy. Here, no, we're getting more into, kind of a complete and direct discussion, both on the place and role in philosophy, but also an illustration of the use of philosophy. Perhaps something similar to what you saw with Maimonides, particularly in the first part of your reading there. So very briefly, and these days this is all available for you anywhere you want. Very briefly, just a biography. Thomas Aquinas, called Aquinas because he was born in Aquino in southern Italy. He went to Paris as a student. And he studied and attended lectures with Albertus Magnus. And Albertus Magnus, on that timeline I showed you earlier, again, one of the figures we normally reference in history of scholastic thought and its development. He continued his studies and got his doctorate of theology in 1257. There was in his time spent at Paris, there was at one point he had quite a bit of a showdown with the Averroists. This is a very important point in his life. The idea is that there was a lot of followers to what we generally call the Averroist tradition, which is gives primacy to reason and the philosophical tradition over the tradition of faith or of revelation or whatnot. Aquinas, as you'll see, was not looking to move towards the primacy of reason, right? And so he did have a showdown at one point with the Averroists, the followers of Ibn Rushd in Paris, in the West. What we're reading here is selections from the Summa Theologia and the Summa Contra Gentiles. The Summa Theologia, important to note, was left unfinished. As far as we know, following a profound revelationary experience at 1273, in light of which he abandons the writing and explains to his secretary, Brother Reginald, I can write no more. All that I have written seems like straw. And this harks back very much into the kind of emphasis on the direct experience and the existential or experiential, if you wish, that encountered with both Augustine and Ghazali already. All right, so obviously there's much more you can say. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you a snapshot of both works, the Summa Contra Gentiles and the Summa Theologia. And I'm going to look at the overall division just to give you a sense of the synthesis, the medieval synthesis being attempted by Aquinas here. And then we'll move to give an illustration from each of the two works. All right? Obviously, there's much more that we leave to our class discussions. So the first selection you'll be reading, taken from the Summa Contra Gentiles. The work is a huge work. It's divided into 4 books, as you can see here. Book 1, of God, which is 102 chapters. Book 2 of Creation, 101 chapters. Book 3 of Providence, 163 chapters. And Book 4 of Salvation. Now, all of these are addressed and approached from within the spirit of the synthesis that we've been talking about, that we've been preluding. Okay? So just to give you an example of some of the sample titles of the work, this is from Book 1 of God, Arguments in proof of the existence of God. Demonstration. Right? So you see the interplay now of reasoning. Right? That God is not body. This is not a statement. This is not a doctrine. This is not a proclamation. This will be argued in that chapter or in that section. That God is his essence. That no accident is found in God. And all that, i.e., it will be shown that. It will be demonstrated that. Right? That God knows singulars. Remember this debate between Ghazali and Ibn Rushd? At least Ghazali and the philosophers, and Ibn Rushd tries to respond to it. That God has will, that God cannot will evil, and so on and so forth. And all of these are demonstrative approaches. Of course, they reference revelation, naturally, right? But they're rooted in very solid, rational arguments, okay? The selections that you're reading come from that particular book, Book 1 of God, and your reading selections cover the following, right? The author's intention and the way in which divine truth is to be made known, and etc. And I'd like to start with the author's intention, right? Where he sets down what he hopes and aims to do in this work. And that will give us the beginnings of our illustration here of what we're calling the medieval synthesis. So here's what St. Thomas Aquinas writes. Among all human pursuits, the pursuit of wisdom is more perfect, more noble, more useful, and more full of joy. And what is the pursuit of wisdom? Sorry? Well, the tool is intellect. Yes, definitely. Philosophy, right? Pursuit of wisdom, love of wisdom, philosophy, yeah. Good? Right, but through the intellect, of course. Yeah. And then he breaks it down for us, why it's more perfect, why it's more noble, etc. So why is it more perfect? Because insofar as man gives himself to the pursuit of wisdom, so far does he even now have some share in true beatitude. Right? So the pursuit of wisdom takes us to beatitude. It is more noble because through this pursuit, man especially approaches to a likeness to God who made all things in wisdom. And since the likeness is the cause of love, the pursuit of wisdom especially joins man to God in friendship. It is more useful because through wisdom we arrive at the kingdom of immortality, and more full of joy because her conversation has no bitterness, etc. Now, note, in reference to more perfect, more noble, and more useful, but certainly the more noble and more useful, right? The connection here begins to show clearly between faith and reason, between revelation and philosophy. Okay, the notion that wisdom takes us the closest to be in the likeness of God, right? And the premise or the principle of the likeness of God is, of course, a theological premise that we're created in the image and likeness of God. Right? And you see, on the one hand, the kind of the hint of the argument followed directly by a reference from Revelation. Right? Because man especially approaches to a likeness of God who, quote, made all things in wisdom. Okay? Same thing at the end with the full of joy. So this is the entire movement of the work to show that the pursuit of wisdom, understood here as philosophy, is one of the central and most useful and most noble methods, not on its own, but to fulfill precisely aspects of what we are called upon to attain through revelation, right? To be in the likeness of God, etc. So once again, you have this, if I may borrow from Ibn Rushd, this notion of philosophy as a means to an end. Okay? The end remains what was given to us through revelation, what we are called upon by God through revelation. Philosophy is the most noble, the most perfect, etc., means to it. Good? Further, he says, again, still on the intention in the present work. And so, he says, in the name of the divine mercy, I have the confidence to embark upon the work of a wise man, even though this may surpass my powers. And I have set myself the task of making known, as far as my limited powers will allow, the truth that the Catholic faith professes, and of setting aside the errors that are opposed to it. Right? If you look at this segment alone, this sounds very, well, theological, very much interested in the truth of Catholic faith. It sounds purely religious. Okay? But if you look at what I showed you earlier, the chapter titles, what he has already mentioned in this first reference from the intention of the author that he's going to be using the pursuit of wisdom. So in other words, if you connect this, making known these truths and setting aside the errors opposed to the faith will be precisely the project achieved or at least pursued, in as far as he can, through the use of philosophical reasoning. Right? And this is a central kind of element of understanding the medieval synthesis, looking at the philosophical reasoning as the tool which will aid and guide our pursuit of the faith, right? And this is something Maimonides had already, I think, quite clearly said in his work when he says, if you don't know the differences between essential and accidental attributes, if you don't know logical reasoning, you really will not know how to read and understand the revelations, right? Okay. So, in this sense, he proposes that the divine truth that he's addressing, of course, is made known to us in a number of ways, right? One, of course, is revelation, the most obvious in monotheism. Right? But what he's also proposing is that there's another aspect that can be attained or known to us via philosophical reasoning, right? So the way of making truth known is not always the same, and as the philosopher has very well said, it belongs to an educated man to seek such certitude in each thing as the nature of that thing allows. Who is the philosopher mentioned here? It's not a philosopher, as the philosopher said. Sorry, I don't have a clicker question on that. I just thought I'd ask. Yes, absolutely. Aristotle. Who else? Right? Who else could it be? Yeah. At other points in the text, he sometimes will refer to the commentator, and the commentator, of course, is Ibn Rushd, right? He begins his argument on the way that truth is made known to man by referencing Aristotle, okay? But here's an important distinction that Aquinas is making here, as you'll see in the second part there, that truth is indeed one. Truth is simple, right? Simple unity, as we saw with Maimonides, also with Ibn Rushd. There's one truth, different path to it. The difference that you'll start to sense here in the medieval synthesis as it progresses and moves forward with Aquinas is that, well, there's kind of two aspects to truth here. Truth is, of course, one, but there are truths about the essence and there are truths about existence, right? There are truths about that God exists, that he is one, and there are truths about what God is, the essence of the divine, right? If you remember from Augustine, what then do I love when I love God? Good? And one of the things that Aquinas will move forward on is to say, well, some of these truths are absolutely accessible through reason, particularly the questions of the existence of God, that he is one, and so on and so forth. However, when it comes to questions about essence, that's not open to reasoning, right? The essence of God, the being of God as God, so to speak, that is not open to rational argumentation or rational conclusions, okay? So that's where you'll see the Aquinas begins to delineate between the realm that you can and you should actually use philosophical reasoning in, and the other realm where, well, it cannot apply, okay? This is, again, part of the proposed medieval synthesis. Oh, I did have a question about that. I'm sorry. I spoiled it. Forgot I added that this morning. All right, sorry. So now we move to speak a bit more about the medieval synthesis by referencing the second work, which, as I said, is left unfinished and nonetheless is a very powerful work. So the second set of selections come to us from the Summa Theologia, which is divided into 3 main parts with a supplement. Part 1, which is of 8 treatises, is 119 questions. Part 2, which is in 2 parts, 303 questions, so really very huge work. 7 treatises for part 3, and then a supplement. And again, just to give you a sampler, just to give you a taste of the kind of things being addressed in this work, right? So this is from first part, chapter 11, what is being addressed: the unity of God, the names of God, the power of God. From the second part, what is happiness, the cause of love, of external causes of sin, right? And again, all of these being addressed really from a very kind of philosophical approach, using at least the tools of philosophy. What is happiness, right? Of course, they'll reverence God and revelation naturally. Second part of the second part, right? There's a section on charity, on gift of wisdom and justice, gluttony, and so on. On Christ's unity of being, the third part, causality. And on the supplement, very interesting, you have matrimony as a sacrament, right? The Sirr al-Zawaj, matrimony as a sacrament, and of the nature of confession, etc. So here what you see in the Summa Theologia is more kind of, in modern days we speak about, applied philosophy. And so here he's taking these higher questions of philosophy. Now he's going into the details of, relevant sacraments and relevant understanding of sin, of gluttony particularly. That was his favorite sin, if you wish. One of the things that is known about Thomas Aquinas is his love of food. So perhaps that's why there's a particular section on gluttony and other such. What we're looking at here is in reference to first part, questions to do with God's existence, okay? And this is essentially where you see, I think, one of the clearest illustrations of the uses of Aristotelian logic, Aristotelian philosophy, if you wish, in addressing questions of faith, right? Not so much in terms of defending the role of philosophy now, but actually using it, right? In a way, let me show you how philosophy can work. And he has a very nice way, approach of doing it. So I just want to take a few seconds to clarify it. So he'll set down a series of questions, and then to each question, he begins with a set of objections, and then replies. The objections are not his. This is very important to keep in mind. The manner in which he writes, which becomes a kind of a basic theme for scholastic writing, okay? So he sets out first the counter arguments to his thesis. So he begins by treating the antithesis, the other standpoint, right? He replies to that. Once he has replied to the objections, he presents his thesis, okay? So whenever you read in the Summa Theologia objection 1, this is not his objection. This is not Aquinas, okay? This is what he wants to respond to before moving on. So in this particular section of part, the first part, question 2, the key question, the existence of God. And this is presented in 3 sub-questions, or 3 articles as he calls them. The first question is whether the proposition God exists is self-evident. The second is whether it is demonstrable, and whether God exists, okay? Breaking it down simpler, the first one basically says, you don't need to prove God's existence. Obviously there is God. It's self-evident, right? Of course, that's very silly simplification from my side. It's, of course, much more than that. Whether it is demonstrable basically says, well, even if God's existence needs to be proven, we don't have the tools to prove it. And then the final question, once he's answered that, he'll say, all right, then, you've convinced me, we have the tools, prove it. Does God exist? Okay? And he goes on through this very meticulous method. For the first proposition, whether the existence of God is self-evident, and I'll illustrate with this, we have three objections, right? So the antithesis, what he's going to argue against. The first very clearly says, and this is referenced from Yohanna Dimashqi, John Damascene, the knowledge of God is naturally implanted in all of us, right? It's almost echoes, if you go back to the Confessions, the very, very first section of Book 1, right? You made this for yourselves, and our hearts will not find peace until they rest in you, right? It's like we're naturally driven to seek the divine, right? We have this ingrained knowledge of God. The second objection says, as soon as the name God is understood, it exists mentally. It also follows that it exists actually. This is a one-statement summary of the argument from St. Anselm, by the way, right? That once you understand what the name God means, it naturally follows that God exists, right? And the fool says there is no God. If there is anything true, there must be truth, but God is truth itself. I am the way, the truth, and the life, therefore God exists is self-evident. Okay? So the three objections here being presented are suggesting that you don't need to prove God's existence. God's existence is obvious, is self-evident. And the notion of self-evident is very important, right? It's evidence for itself. Good? So that's the idea of self-evident. So the process that he takes is to respond to each of these objections, right? And the summary response is this. The proposition God is can be the opposite of the proposition God is can be mentally admitted. The fool said in his heart, there is no God. Therefore, that God exists is not self-evident. So the summary response is basically, look, if God's existence is self-evident, how can I propose its opposite? How can I then say God doesn't exist, right? So this is, of course, not the full answer. But the summary answer says, the very fact that I can deny God's existence already shows that God's existence is actually not self-evident, right? So I need to demonstrate it. So here's his three replies, very briefly. And I'm only going through these details, very small section of your readings, just to illustrate the method that he's going to be using in terms of what we are here calling the medieval synthesis. So to the first response, the John Damascene argument that the knowledge of God is naturally implanted, right? Aquinas says, to know God exists in general is not the same, really, as to know that God exists, right? So the idea is we may have some general notion, but we don't have, that's not the same as knowing that God exists. Sorry, let me just give a very brief example. Which he gives, sorry. Yeah? If you see someone crossing the street, is very different from seeing Ali crossing the street, or Hani, or Mahiddin, or anyone, right? So we may have this kind of general ambiguous knowledge, but we don't have, it's not the same. Okay? To the second, he responds, perhaps not everyone who hears this name, God, understands it to signify, right? That was, sorry. So the idea that once you understand the name God, then you will understand it exists mentally and it must exist actually. So the crux of the basic juice, if you wish, of St. Anselm's argument was, what is God? The best way to capture the definition is to say the following. God is the being than which none greater can be conceived. Yeah? Sorry. It's Anselm, not me. Yeah? The idea is, God, by definition, is that being than which none greater can be thought possible. He's, if you wish, the greatest. But really, this is a much stronger way of saying it. But if God is the being than which none greater can be thought possible, he cannot only exist in the mind, because then he would have been greater if he existed in reality. So God must exist. Yes, sorry. I'm really running through this. I'm sure you'll discuss it further in your class. The response to this briefly is, sure, that works if that's what you mean every time you think God. When I say God, if I really mean, the being than which none greater can be thought possible, sure, then khalas, it exists. But to most, that's not what they hear when they name, when they hear the name God, that's not what they understand, and so God's existence is not self-evident, and so on and so forth. Again, obviously, I'm not going to go through the whole text with you. I'm just giving you illustrations of his method. From that, he goes to the second set of objections. Well, good, God's existence is not self-evident, but guess what, ya Thomas, you can't prove it. Right, for various reasons, okay? There's a discrepancy between cause and effect, and we normally prove the existence of something from working back from effect, and etc. And again, he responds to these. All right, sorry. There. No. All right. And basically, the summary response is, all the arguments against proving God's existence work if you think I'm trying to understand his essence. But remember my initial premise. Reason can address questions of God's existence, not God's essence. I'm not looking to understand God's essence. I'm simply looking to use reason to prove his existence, right? And that, as Aquinas will show, can actually be done. And from there, he goes to the final question, whether God exists. He addresses it, and he presents the famous famous, if you know, within the Aquinas tradition, the 5 proofs for God's existence. And the final word I want to say on that is the following. The proofs themselves are essentially the illustration of Aristotelian reasoning or logic or tools from philosophy helping us address questions of faith and revelation. Right? Especially when you look at the proofs for God's existence, look at the first 3, they're essentially Aristotelian. They're almost taken out from Aristotle's work. What I want to conclude with, and I know time's up, I just need 10, 20 seconds. As I said earlier, there's general evaluation of scholasticism is usually weak and, negative. Hopefully, as you go through and discuss further, much further than what we did here today, the works of Aquinas and the questions he raises, the approaches he takes, hopefully you get a sense of a higher evaluation. I'm not saying adopt it. I'm not saying, pick it up. But I will allow myself to to conclude with words that are totally not my own. This is from a great work called Aristotle's Children. And I'll leave you with this conclusion. Rubinstein, he says, in reliving the Aristotelian revolution, we understand that we are not just the children of Copernicus and Galileo, Adam Smith, Thomas Jefferson, but Aristotle's children, the heirs of a medieval tradition that seems more intriguing and inspiring as the shortcomings of modernity become clearer. Of course, most of us would not return to the Middle Ages if we could. Few people today would embrace the assumptions and conclusions of the medieval scholastics. But the Aristotelians' quest for meaning is also ours, and we have much to learn from their vision of a science infused by ethics and a religion unafraid of reason. In this little-known but formative chapter of our history, we may detect hints of a more humane and integrated global future. End quote. And thank you for your attention. Sorry, make sure you give back the clickers. Yes? Thank you.